Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the Middle Ages, so go ahead, dim the lights, take a slow breath, maybe soften your pillow a little, because we're about to explore something that medieval textbooks tend to quietly tiptoe around. Yes, royalty, medieval royalty, but not the majestic, dignified, bathed more than twice a year kind. No, tonight we'll drift through the lives of kings, queens, and nobles who enjoyed being high, some on incense, some on wine, some on herbs they pretended were medicinal, and some simply high on power, ego, or whatever mild hallucinogen the local monastery garden accidentally produced. We're taking our time with this, hovering gently, no rushing through centuries, just floating from one mildly scandalous noble to the next, as if we were strolling through a medieval palace where everyone is just slightly more intoxicated than they should be. So let's settle in and drift into the first royal fiasco of the evening. King Philip IV of France, high on beauty, ego, and probably incense. Philip IV, known to his admirers as Philip the Fair, was called that not because he was especially virtuous, but because he looked like the medieval version of a moody runway model. High cheekbones, long hair, and an expression that said, "I haven't slept since last Tuesday, but I'm pretending this is intentional." Philip was intensely fond of incense, especially during court rituals. By fond, chroniclers meant he burned enough of it to make his entire court appear in a permanent mystical haze, like a poorly ventilated yoga studio. Visitors often wrote that entering his palace felt like standing inside a cloud, a polite, medieval way of saying, "We all left slightly dizzy." Was Philip trying to elevate the royal aura? Probably. Was he just trying to smell better than his nobles? Also probably. Did anyone dare complain about the air quality? Absolutely not. The man did execute the Knights Templar for less. Let's drift onward. Charles VI of France, high on lead, mercury, and bad medical advice. Charles VI was born into a dynasty where rational medical decisions were rare. So naturally, when he began experiencing bouts of psychosis, medieval physicians offered their finest treatments: lead mercury, cold baths, and occasionally prayer. Nothing says healing like swallowing metals that even alchemists approached with caution. Under this shimmering cocktail of questionable substances, Charles had episodes where he believed he was made of glass. He would shuffle around wrapped in blankets, fearing that a strong handshake could shatter him. Was he technically high? Not on purpose. But if your daily prescribed diet involves mercury, then yes, your perception of reality is probably floating several feet above the ground. Let's drift to someone more recreational about it. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, high on experiments and exotic substances. Frederick II was a genius, but he was also the kind of genius who collected rare animals, conducted strange experiments, and once tried to determine the natural human language by refusing to let infants hear speech. They did not, tragically, begin speaking Hebrew, Latin, or bird. Frederick's court was filled with alchemists, herbal specialists, and astrologers, all of whom loved brewing things they described as enlightening to the humors. This is medieval speak for you will feel light, warm, and a little too honest afterward. He drank concoctions from distant lands, herbal infusions, spiced wines, syrups laced with plants European monks pretended not to recognize. It made him famously serene, which was helpful when dealing with rebellious nobles, or, in moments of peak medieval absurdity, the Pope. Onward we float. King Wenceslas IV of Bohemia, high on alcohol, all day, every day. Wenceslas was known for two things: getting drunk, staying drunk, and occasionally ruling Bohemia in between. Chroniclers noted that he kept drinking companions on the payroll. These were not friends. These were people professionally obligated to sit with him while he drank through a backlog of wine barrels. When sober, which was rare enough to be noteworthy, Wenceslas could be charming. When not sober, he arrested bishops, wandered the forest at night, and once had a blacksmith dragged before him because he didn't like the man's haircut. A king truly committed to the craft. Floating on Eleanor of Aquitaine, high on freedom and mild herbal tea, Eleanor stands out as one of the most capable medieval rulers, sharp, witty, and intimidating in the kind of way that makes men in positions of power extremely uncomfortable. She loved herbal remedies. Her personal gardens included lavender, mint, rosemary, tansy, and a few herbs polite chroniclers called stimulating to the senses, which is medieval code for "we are not writing this down directly." Her court in Aquitaine became famous for poetry, music, perfumed air, and possibly a few relaxing plant-based infusions enjoyed during long summer evenings. She never spiraled into chaos like the men on this list. She simply understood that sometimes ruling Europe required a cup of something calming. Let's drift towards someone who preferred the opposite. King John of England, high on rage and maybe bad mead. King John was not known for calmness, or good decision-making, or good hygiene, or literacy above a level one might gently describe as functional. He drank heavily, often to dull the pain of being the least talented son of a famously chaotic family. Chroniclers noted that during negotiations he would slam back cup after cup of strong mead, turning diplomacy into something resembling a tavern argument. The more he drank, the worse his decisions became. This ultimately led to the barons imposing the Magna Carta, essentially the medieval version of "we need to set rules before you do anything else." A king defeated by beverages and paperwork, floating on Queen Isabella of Castile's half-brother, Henry IV, high on hallucinogenic fumes. Henry IV of Castile was fond of spiritual rituals. He loved incense, but not the gentle church kind. He preferred thick mixtures burned so heavily that the room blurred into something resembling a mystical fog bank. Chroniclers noted that he often swayed during ceremonies. They attributed it to spiritual ecstasy. More likely, he was standing inside a hot box of medieval aromatics. Combined with exhaustion, stress, and questionable medical advice, Henry developed a reputation for drifting in and out of awareness during council meetings. A king floating somewhere between heaven, earth, and poorly ventilated chambers. We drift onward. Charles the Bold, high on herbal medicines, mostly by accident. Charles the Bold suffered from headaches, stomach issues, and the unbearable pressure of being a Carolingian in decline. His doctors offered the usual medieval solutions: strong herbal drafts, stronger herbal drafts, and please lie down before you fall down. Many of these mixtures contained opiates, perfectly legal, perfectly normal, perfectly effective at making kings feel like soft clouds drifting over a battlefield. He wrote letters complaining about feeling lightheaded and detached, which is medieval noble language for "my doctor gave me something, and now my crown feels like it's floating beside me." Moving on. Eric XIV of Sweden, high on arsenic, because why not? Technically late medieval, still relevant. Eric XIV experienced paranoia, mood swings, and outbursts that alarmed his court. So naturally, his doctors fed him arsenic. Why? Because they believed it stimulated vitality. It did not. What it did stimulate was hallucinations, trembling, and the occasional horrifying decision, like murdering a nobleman with a spear in the middle of a meal. Eric eventually calmed down, possibly because they lowered the arsenic, possibly because he was finally imprisoned. Hard to say. Let's drift to someone less terrifying. Louis X of France, high on wine and terrible athletic choices. Louis X was an enthusiastic drinker and an equally enthusiastic athlete. He enjoyed wine so much that he often drank before engaging in sports like real tennis. This went poorly. In one famous incident, after drinking heavily on a hot summer day, Louis insisted on a vigorous match. He overheated, collapsed, and died shortly afterward, leaving chroniclers to delicately conclude that perhaps, just perhaps, hydration is important. A king undone by cardio, floating on King Sancho II of Portugal, high on not doing his job. Sancho II wasn't high on substances. He was high on apathy. He preferred hunting, feasting, sleeping, and ignoring the entire institution of governance. Clergymen complained that he floated through life as if half dreaming, which is polite medieval phrasing for "we have no idea if he understands he is king." Eventually the Pope replaced him with his brother, a gentle medieval way of saying, please get off the throne. Drifting. Vladislav II of Bohemia. High on incense and symbolic ceremony, Vladislav loved theatrical rituals. He adored smoky, incense-filled liturgies that made everyone feel like they were attending a very slow-moving concert inside a cloud. The more haze, the more holy he appeared. Sometimes he fainted. Chroniclers blamed fasting, but realistically, if you stand still for 2 hours breathing incense thick enough to make your crown levitate, fainting is kind of expected. Softly drifting. Richard II of England. High on perfumes and artistic aesthetics, Richard II wasn't intoxicated in the traditional sense, but he was deeply committed to aromatics, scented chambers, and perfumed clothing. Visitors described his palace as sweet, warm, and heady, which sounds suspiciously like someone overusing medieval essential oils. He liked the way the scents made him feel serene, elevated, slightly too royal. His nobles thought he was disconnected from reality, and he was, just not chemically, emotionally. We float again. Queen Jean of Navarre. High on alchemy. Jean sponsored alchemists, herbalists, and mystics. She wasn't reckless, fascinated. Her workshops produced infusions, elixirs, and occasionally mixtures designed to clarify the mind, which, judging by medieval standards, probably did the opposite. Her letters hint at enjoying pleasant warmth from her tonics, a subtle nod to the fact that medieval alchemy was basically early experimental pharmacology, without the safety testing part. Floating to the last figure of Part 1. King Alfonso X of Castile. High on astronomy and probably herbal concentration aids, Alfonso loved studying the stars late into the night. To stay awake, he used herbal stimulants recommended by court physicians, likely containing ingredients we would diplomatically describe as very effective. He spent hours staring into the sky, charting celestial motions while sipping on tonics that left his mind drifting somewhere between science and gentle hallucination. His assistants often had to remind him to rest. He never listened. He preferred floating with the cosmos. And that gently concludes Part 1. A slow drift through medieval royalties who, in one way or another, enjoyed ascending chemically, emotionally, spiritually, or simply through poor medical practices. Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's ease ourselves into Part 2. As gently as a medieval monk falling asleep over an illuminated manuscript he has been copying for 14 consecutive hours. If you're listening at night, this is a good moment to adjust your blankets. Maybe roll your shoulders and let your mind settle. We're continuing our quiet wander through medieval royals who floated through life in ways that were, let's say, elevated. Some of them were high on wine, others on herbs, others on incense thick enough to qualify as atmospheric weather, and some were simply high on their own, deeply questionable sense of destiny. So let's drift calmly back into the haze of the Middle Ages and meet the next batch of nobles who preferred life several inches above reality. 1. King Sigismund of Luxembourg. High on astrology and dramatic self-importance, Sigismund was the kind of medieval king who treated astrology the way modern CEOs treat life coaches, very seriously, and with absolutely no sense of proportion. He surrounded himself with astrologers who burned fragrant resins, herbs, and oils in order to clarify celestial insight. These ceremonies filled his study with so much smoke that ambassadors routinely had to blink through the haze while listening to him explain why. Mars, being in a grumpy mood, justified a new diplomatic alliance. He believed his destiny was written in the stars, and unfortunately, his astrologers paid quite generously agreed with him. Was he chemically high? Not exactly, but he lived in a permanent astrological fog, drifting through life as if every mildly inconvenient event was personal sabotage committed by Mercury. Let's drift onward. 2. Joanna of Castile. Mona la Loca. High on grief, court politics, and confusing herbal treatments, Joanna's story is often sensationalized, so we'll tread softly here. Much of her suffering came not from her mind, but from the men around her, who decided that labeling her mad was far more convenient than letting her rule. Still, she was given countless medicinal mixtures by court physicians herbal brews designed to restore balance. In reality, these often included sedatives strong enough to tranquilize a mildly irritated goat. Combined with unending grief after her husband's death and the political pressure from her father and son, Joanna lived in a haze of sorrow, herbs, and manipulation. She wandered castle corridors at night because frankly everyone else in her life made staying still unbearable. Of all the royals on this list, Joanna was the least deserving of the treatment she received, and the most victimized by medieval medicine. We float softly forward. 3. Henry II of England, high on adrenaline, anger, and possibly spiced wine. Henry II was a high-energy medieval king, which was already dangerous in an era when most rulers barely moved faster than a slow procession. He paced constantly. He argued loudly. He traveled so quickly that his courtiers regularly fell behind, wheezing in exhaustion. And he loved spiced wine, a lot. Medieval spiced wine was no gentle mulled drink. It often included herbs with mood-changing effects, spices that heated the blood, and enough alcohol to make even a seasoned knight blink twice. Henry drank it to calm down, which is unfortunate, because it usually did the opposite. The more he drank, the louder he got. The louder he got, the worse his decisions became. And eventually, that led to the infamous "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" moment, essentially the medieval version of shouting something you immediately regret. Let's drift to someone who preferred less yelling and more floating. 4. Charles V of France, high on prayer, mysticism, and quiet herbal restoratives. Charles V, unlike many kings on this list, was calm, thoughtful, and introverted. He preferred quiet evenings, illuminated manuscripts, and soft herbal tonics brewed by monastic physicians. He suffered from chronic migraines, debilitating ones, so his doctors provided soothing mixtures to relax his nerves. These mixtures worked, sometimes too well. Many chroniclers describe him sitting silently in dim, scented rooms, drifting in and out of contemplative states, while monks chanted softly nearby. He ruled wisely, but always with an air of detachment, as if he viewed politics from just outside his own body. If you've ever had a strong herbal tea at 2 a.m. and suddenly felt like your existence is a very gentle misunderstanding, Charles lived that way daily, floating on. 5. The Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos, high on incense and triumph. Michael VIII reclaimed Constantinople, an accomplishment so dramatic that he spent the rest of his reign bathing in literal clouds of incense. Byzantine ceremonies were already intense, involving gold embroidery, chanting, candlelight, and the kind of perfumed smoke that made visitors question if their depth perception was still functioning. Michael intensified all of it. More incense, more chanting, more pageantry. When foreign ambassadors visited, they often left feeling lightheaded, not just from the political tension, but because they had inhaled enough frankincense to qualify as honorary choir members. Was Michael addicted? No, he was simply a Byzantine emperor, which was more or less the same thing. Let's drift westward. 6. King Louis IX of France, high on holiness and probably fasting-induced euphoria. Louis X. Later, St. Louis was genuinely devout, but his religious intensity bordered on the extreme. He fasted frequently, prayed for hours, and performed rituals that sometimes pushed his body to the edge of collapse. Prolonged fasting can induce a natural, involuntary sense of euphoria, light, floating feeling. Chroniclers describe him as serene, glowing, and removed from earthly burdens, which sounds very noble, until you remember he was often making political decisions in that state. His nobles quietly hoped he would eat more often, preferably something with protein. We drift gently into another kingdom. 7. Mary, Queen of Hungary, high on sleep tonics. Mary suffered from insomnia, brutal condition, in a time when the only remedy was here. Drink this. It might help, or it might stop your breathing. Good luck. She was given strong sleep potions containing poppy, mandrake, henbane, and occasionally cannabis-infused oils. Physicians back then believed that if a little worked, more would work better. This led to Mary spending long stretches in a heavy, groggy state. drifting between sleep and wakefulness, with all the clarity of someone reading fine print underwater. Her decisions during this time were slow, very slow, but everyone politely pretended they hadn't noticed. Floating onward. 8. Emperor Wen of China, early medieval, high on herbal longevity tonics, a brief but fitting drift eastward. Wen loved herbal tonics designed to extend life. These mixtures were brewed by court alchemists who promised vitality, clarity, energy, and balance. In modern terms, he was drinking ancient energy drinks blended with traditional medicine, minus the FDA. Some of these concoctions contained ephedrine stimulants, which made him sharp, alert, and occasionally too awake. Chroniclers describe him pacing at night, reflecting on philosophy with an enthusiasm that suggested something stronger than tea was involved. We drift back toward Europe. 9. King Afonso V of Portugal, high on courtly romance and rose-scented potions. Afonso V adored romance literature. He believed wholeheartedly in chivalry, courtly love, and the emotional power of floral fragrances. He surrounded himself with rose-scented oils, lavender bath infusions, and aromatic salves prepared by palace apothecaries. Did they elevate his mood? Absolutely. Did they sometimes make him too relaxed during negotiations? Also, absolutely. Portuguese courtiers gently hinted that perhaps he should switch from rose oil to something a little less dreamy. He did not. Drifting softly. 10. King Eric of Pomerania, high on weird maritime brews. Eric spent much of his life sailing, raiding, and overseeing trade across the Baltic. He also drank every strange concoction sailors brought him. Sea voyagers carried fermented berry liquors, herbal spirits from murky northern forests, and brews made from plants nobody could identify. Even at the time, Eric drank all of them, often before important decisions, which explains why his rule felt like a long slow motion, waves, sometimes rising, sometimes falling, never entirely predictable, floating into colder regions. 11. Ivan II of Moscow, high on monastic melancholy and spiritual potions. Ivan II was gentle, melancholy, and deeply tied to the Russian Orthodox Church. Monastic healers prescribed herbal infusions meant to soothe his chronic sadness. These mixtures often included calming sedatives, safe enough in moderation, but Ivan favored abundance. He drifted through life quietly, speaking softly, moving slowly, and feeling everything with the emotional weight of a damp winter morning. His nobles found him too passive. His monks found him admirably serene. He found himself somewhere in between, floating through a political landscape he barely wanted to participate in. We drift onward. 12. King Charles III of Navarre, high on elaborate perfume rituals. Charles III, known as the Noble, was obsessed with scents. He commissioned perfumes, oils, scented gloves, and aromatic cloths. Some of these mixtures contained mild, mood-altering ingredients, especially the resins imported from North Africa. His palace was described as softly fragrant, which is medieval chronicler language for our eyes are watering slightly, but we are afraid to say anything. Visitors often felt drowsy after long audiences with Charles, thanks to the warm, perfumed air. The king himself seemed permanently calm, drifting through governance, as if each decision were a gently scented suggestion. Floating again. 13. Philip the Good of Burgundy, high on wine, fashion, and his own reputation. Philip drank heavily, dressed extravagantly, and held feasts so decadent that even fellow nobles politely whispered, "This might be too much." He believed wine expanded creativity. It also expanded his confidence, generosity, and tendency to approve expensive projects after several cups. His court chronicler once wrote, "The Duke was in a very inspired mood tonight. This is polite medieval phrasing for 3 goblets in, and he started talking about building a new golden fountain shaped like himself." Drifting to another figure. 14. Ladislas the Posthumous, high on fragile health and medicinal syrups. Ladislas was born after his father died, hence the posthumous. He spent much of his childhood in the care of physicians who were determined to keep him alive through non-stop treatments. These treatments included syrups laced with poppy, calming herbs, and whatever restorative tonics were fashionable that month. He grew into a pale, quiet, dreamy young man who looked like he had spent his life drifting gently down a river of medicinal honey. He wasn't irresponsible, just permanently sedated by good intentions. We reached the last figure of part 2, 15. John II of Aragon. High on the belief that he was always right, some royals were intoxicated not by substances, but by sheer, unshakable ego. John too was one of them. He believed every decision he made was divinely correct, even when it clearly wasn't, especially when it wasn't. He floated through political crises with serene confidence, stubbornly insisting that the fault lay with everyone except himself. No herbs required, just pure, unfiltered self-assurance, strong enough to intoxicate an entire council chamber. And that brings us to the end of part 2, a soft journey through royals drifting on wine, incense, herbs, medicine, mysticism, confidence, and occasionally pure delusion. Hey again, welcome back. Let's settle in for part 3, drifting even deeper into the soft scented haze of medieval royalty. If you're listening at bedtime, now's a good moment to adjust your pillow, loosen your jaw, and let your breathing slow down just a little. We're gliding into another quiet lineup of kings, queens, dukes, and wandering nobles who lived, well, not quite on earth, more like halfway between their throne room and a fragrant cloud of whatever got them through the day. In tonight's soft little continuation, we'll explore more figures who were chemically elevated, spiritually elevated, emotionally elevated, or simply delusionally elevated. No judgment, just gentle medieval ambience. So, let's drift. 1. Charles the Bad of Navarre. High on alchemy and extremely bad ideas. Charles the Bad wasn't given that nickname because he was evil. He was given it because he kept doing things that any reasonable advisor would have said, "Charles, please don't." He was obsessed with alchemy, convinced he could transmute metals into gold. His workshops burned with fumes, sulfur, mercury, and mixtures that would send modern safety inspectors into cardiac arrest. His alchemists inhaled the fumes. Charles inhaled the fumes. Everyone was inhaling the fumes. He made decisions while surrounded by thick metallic smoke, which explains a lot about his diplomatic record. He also consumed alchemical tinctures to refine the spirit. This refined his spirit right into a state of mild confusion. Let us drift onward to Isabella of France. High on political fury and clerical tonics, Isabella, the she-wolf of France, was married to England's Edward II. Their marriage was a long, slow disaster that not even medieval herbal tonics could fix. Isabella eventually revolted against her husband, but along the way she endured years of clerical remedies meant to calm her nerves. These included poppy preparations, sedative bombs, heavy hitting, medieval teas that monks brewed when they thought a noblewoman needed to relax before she broke something expensive. The tonics didn't calm her much, but they did give her a steady, serene exterior, while she internally built a quiet storm powerful enough to overthrow a king. Let's float gently forward. 3. Alfonso X of Castile. High on learning, scented rooms, and star charts, Alfonso X adored science, poetry, astronomy, and soft-scented halls filled with incense. He wasn't high on substances so much as high on enthusiasm, but the fragrances of his court were described as heavy enough to weigh upon the mind. He worked late into the night, surrounded by manuscripts, spices, burning oils, and astronomers arguing about planetary alignments. Alfonso believed deeply in astrology's influence on health. When he felt unwell, he burned more incense. When the astrologers disagreed, he burned even more. Eventually his workspaces resembled spiritual steam rooms where scholars debated constellations while quietly forgetting what year it was, drifting softly. 4. Sigurd the Crusader. High on warlike fervor and fermented honey wine king, Sigurd of Norway led a crusade fueled partly by religious zeal and partly by a beverage the Norse loved, mead. Fermented honey wine can be gentle, but medieval mead, let's just say it could knock out a bard, to minstrels, and the horse they rode in on. Sigurd drank often, sometimes before negotiations. which gave him a legendary confidence that was not always matched by reality. But he pushed through life in a golden haze of belief, courage, and fermented honey. Let's drift to a quieter figure. 5. Valdemar IV of Denmark, high on ointments from his personal apothecary. Valdemar suffered from chronic aches and pains, since medieval rulers spent half their lives in armor and the other half pretending they weren't. He stressed. His solution was ointments, dozens of them, heavy, fragrant salves made from poppy oil, forest herbs, pine resins, and occasionally ingredients no one could identify. His courtiers remarked that you could smell Valdemar coming before you heard him. The king was often deeply relaxed, occasionally dazed, and always moisturized, floating onward. 6. Wenceslas IV of Bohemia, high on drink, dogs, and avoiding his job. Wenceslas preferred drinking, hunting, and napping, with his dozens of dogs overruling. His court documents describe him as often indisposed, which is noble phrasing, for he drank too much again. He also surrounded himself with warm, incense-filled chambers, where he drank heavily spiced wines that blurred the edges of his responsibilities. He wasn't irresponsible. He was simply drifting in a warm canine cuddle pile when he was supposed to be attending council meetings. Honestly, relatable. Let's drift. 7. Andrew II of Hungary, high on silver mines and delusions of financial genius. Andrew too didn't indulge in herbs or wine as much as he indulged in economically questionable optimism. He believed he could solve any financial crisis by granting away more land. This kept him in a perpetual state of fiscal bliss, detached entirely from reality. His nobles begged him to stop. He did not stop. He simply continued giving away estates as if they were party favors. He lived in a warm, self-made fantasy bubble, one where numbers didn't matter and generosity fixed everything. A pleasant delusion, if nothing else. Drifting onward. 8. Eleanor of Aquitaine, high on power, politics, and herb-infused baths. Eleanor was brilliant, charismatic, and frankly too competent for half the men she married. She loved luxurious baths scented with mint, rosemary, lavender, and any herb that promised vitality. These baths were so strongly infused that chroniclers noted their scent lingered in entire corridors. Eleanor emerged from them glowing, calm, and ready to outmaneuver whichever duke or king needed to be humbled that day. She wasn't chemically altered. She just weaponized aromatherapy. Floating. 9. Charles VI of France, high on fragile sanity and physician tonics. We'll treat Charles VI gently here. He suffered from severe bouts of mental illness, and his physicians often administered strong sedatives and herbal concoctions to soothe him. Some of these were calming, some were too calming. He drifted through long periods in a dreamlike haze, sometimes forgetting who he was. The court moved quietly around him, managing his episodes with as much dignity as medieval medicine allowed. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the reality of a king who lived much of his life between waking and dreaming. Drifting softly to another court. 10. Margaret of Anjou, high on fury, nerves, and restorative waters. Margaret spent most of her life fighting politically, militarily, emotionally. Her physicians occasionally insisted she drink restorative waters infused with calming herbs. These worked for a few hours, until she remembered her entire life was falling apart. She wasn't high so much as overwhelmed, exhausted, and occasionally chemically encouraged to take a nap. Unfortunately, she rarely took one. Let's drift into Eastern Europe. 11. Casimir the Great, high on romance and aphrodisiac cocktails. Casimir the Great had many mistresses, enough that diplomatic letters politely hinted he should perhaps focus on his kingdom occasionally. His personal physicians brewed aphrodisiac drinks made from herbs that boosted energy, mood, and let's say enthusiasm. These were powerful mixtures, heated over low flames while incense burned nearby. Casimir drank them regularly, floating through life with the hazy confidence of someone with truly questionable priorities. Floating over to Italy. 12. Joanna I of Naples, high on perfume, velvet rooms, and selective denial. Joanna loved luxury. Her rooms were filled with velvet hangings, soft carpets, silk pillows, and the richest perfumes in Europe. These fragrances were thick and heady, strong enough to make visitors slightly dizzy. Her approach to crises was simple: stay calm, stay scented, and pretend the problem wasn't there until someone else handled it. Was it practical? Not really. Did it improve her mood? Resoundingly yes. Drifting north. 13. King Magnus VI of Norway, high on herbal bombs for his chronic ailments. Magnus suffered from recurring illnesses, so his physicians prepared herbal bombs and breathing steams to ease his symptoms. Picture the medieval version of a spa treatment, but in a drafty wooden building where the herbs sometimes steamed a bit too strongly. Magnus often emerged from these treatments looking dazed but peaceful, like someone who just had a nap he wasn't planning on. Floating. 14. Emperor Frederick II, high on curiosity, odd experiments, and exotic spices. Frederick II was a scientist in an age that did not appreciate scientists. He conducted experiments, bred exotic animals, and surrounded himself with Eastern spices, incense, and perfumes. His feasts used rare seasonings that created a warm, sensory fog around the table. Guests sometimes left blinking and asking what exactly they had eaten. Frederick wasn't intoxicated, just constantly overstimulated by the intellectual and aromatic extravagance of his court. We drift to the final figure in part 3. 15. King Ferdinand I of Portugal, high on devotion, fasting, and stress-induced detachment. Ferdinand fasted frequently as part of his devotion, combined with crushing political pressure. This left him in long stretches of light-headed calm. His decisions became slower, softer, and sometimes strangely serene. His advisors tried to encourage him to eat more. He nodded, smiled, and continued fasting. A king peacefully drifting somewhere between responsibility and religious escape. Hey everyone, let's drift back once more. Settle your shoulders, let your breathing slow, and let's wander into a chapter of history that isn't medieval at all, but feels strangely cozy in its own woodland, chaotic way. Tonight, we're drifting into the quiet forests of ancient Germania, the misty homeland of Arminius. Yes, that Arminius, the man who traumatized Rome so deeply that they kept mentioning him in memoirs for centuries, usually with the tone of someone complaining about back pain that never healed properly. But don't worry, we're staying in sleepy mode. Just gentle treason, light mutiny, and the soft sound of Romans panicking in the distance. Drifting into the forests of young Arminius. Arminius was born around 18 BCE, somewhere in the tangled woodlands that Romans referred to collectively as Germania, which was their polite way of saying whatever's happening out there is terrifying and we don't want to investigate. He belonged to the Carusi tribe, one of those groups that lived in a quiet, tree-heavy region where people communicated primarily through loyalty, revenge, and various degrees of shouting. As a young noble, Arminius had the rare honor of being taken to Rome as a hostage and educated, which was the Roman Empire's favorite way of saying, "Welcome. You will absolutely like it here. You have no choice." Luckily, Arminius adapted. He learned Latin. He studied Roman military tactics. He rode horses properly instead of the barbarian way, which Romans described as too enthusiastic. And in time, he earned Roman citizenship, as well as the rank of a Quaestor knight. This essentially meant that Rome had invested a great deal of time and training into him. So naturally, he would eventually use all of it against Rome, because of course he would. Let's wander toward the inevitable betrayal by his mid-20s. Arminius was stationed back near his homeland, serving under Publius Quinctilius Verus. Verus was the Roman governor of Germania. His personality could be described gently as someone who looked at a forest full of angry tribes and thought, "Yes, I can absolutely tax this." Arminius, meanwhile, was quietly observing all this with the expression of a man who is planning something unwise, irreversible, and surprisingly well organized. He noticed that the Germanic tribes were deeply unhappy with Roman rule. Taxes, land, seizures, and the general Roman attitude of "this belongs to us now" were not inspiring great enthusiasm. So Arminius began whispering, and visiting, and negotiating, one tribe at a time. slowly weaving alliances the way a spider makes a web, patiently, invisibly, and with more legs metaphorically involved than anyone quite realized. Varys trusted him completely, which tells you everything you need to know about Varys. The Teutoburg Forest, the sophist catastrophe Rome ever suffered. In the year 09 CE, Arminius led Varys and 3 Roman legions deep into the Teutoburg Forest. It was, and remains, an environment specifically designed for ambushes, narrow paths, tall trees, thick mist, and the vague, unsettling sensation that someone is watching you from behind a bush and will definitely hit you with something unpleasant later. The Romans, marching in a long column with supply wagons, civilians, and the general tendency to underestimate everyone, followed Arminius into the woods. Arminius then politely excused himself, claiming he needed to gather more allies. This was technically true, though not in the way Varys expected. Once Arminius was safely away, he signaled the waiting Germanic forces, and what followed was a 3-day dismantling of Roman dignity so complete that historians are still massaging their temples over it. But remember, this is a relaxing bedtime story, so imagine it all happening at a very slow pace. Lots of forest sounds, lots of confused Romans, lots of Arminius quietly leading an operation that made Rome rethink its entire northern policy. The result: 3 annihilated legions, Varys overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster, taking his own life, and the Roman frontier permanently pulling back to the Rhine because Rome had absolutely no interest in reenacting this particular episode. It was one of the worst military defeats in Roman history, and Arminius became a legend overnight. Rome reacts mostly by panicking softly when news reached Emperor Augustus. He reportedly spent days wandering around his palace, muttering Quinctilius Varus, "Give me back my legions," which is the ancient equivalent of quietly swearing at your ceiling because things have gone very wrong. Rome didn't collapse. Of course, it was Rome. It had backup armies, backup generals, and backup arrogance. But Augustus understood something crucial. Arminius wasn't just another tribal leader. He was someone who could unite the independent, stubborn, frequently argumentative Germanic tribes, which made him a threat, a massive one. The Romans reorganized their northern defenses. They reinforced the Rhine frontier, and they began sending experienced generals like Germanicus to contain the situation. Arminius, meanwhile, was celebrating his success in the calm, understated style of a man whose entire strategy had worked perfectly despite relying on tribal cooperation, which historically was about as stable as a soap bubble in a hailstorm. Drifting through the Germanicus campaigns from 14 to 16 CE, Rome made several attempts to punish Arminius for the Teutoburg incident. Germanicus, the new commander, was the imperial equivalent of sending your best student to fix the mess left by the class clown. He led multiple campaigns across the Rhine. There were battles, skirmishes, heroic speeches, and a general sense that everyone involved was extremely tired. Arminius fought fiercely. Germanicus fought fiercely. Neither one managed to decisively defeat the other. At one point, Arminius almost captured Germanicus himself. At another, Germanicus recovered 2 of the lost legionary eagles' Rome's cherished standards, which helped restore Roman morale. But nothing truly changed. The frontier stayed where it was. Arminius remained alive, and the forests remained deeply unimpressed by Rome's efforts. Eventually, Emperor Tiberius recalled Germanicus, largely because these campaigns were expensive, exhausting, and accomplishing nothing except raising Germanicus's popularity, which Tiberius despised on principle. So Rome gave up. Arminius had won, not through one battle, but through simple endurance. He stayed where he was. Rome stayed out. Arminius's slow, predictable downfall. You'd think Arminius would live out his days as a celebrated hero, but this is ancient tribal politics, where loyalty is a general suggestion rather than a permanent state. After Teutoburg, Arminius tried to unite the Germanic tribes into something resembling a kingdom. But tribes historically do not like unifying. They prefer independence, shouting matches, occasional revenge, and traditions involving minimal administrative paperwork. Arminius's authority began to irritate other chieftains. Some felt he was too powerful, some found him too ambitious, some were simply annoyed because they felt like it, and slowly, quietly, predictably, his coalition frayed. In 21 CE, members of his own family betrayed him. He was assassinated, not by Rome, but by fellow Germanic nobles who decided they'd rather return to their normal schedule of feuding than deal with the kingdom-making. Thus ended the life of Arminius, forest strategist, Roman-trained rebel, and a man whose career peaked extremely early. Let's drift toward the afterglow after his death. Germanic tribes returned to their usual rhythms of alliances, rivalries, and dramatic seasonal disagreements. But Arminius lingered in memory. To the Romans, he became a cautionary tale about trusting local auxiliaries too much. To later German writers, he became a folk hero, sometimes awkwardly romanticized, sometimes militantly glorified, always larger than the real man who simply wanted independence and perhaps a quieter, less treacherous family. Today, his most famous legacy is simple. He stopped Rome. He froze the empire's expansion. He preserved the cultural and linguistic roots of entire regions simply by winning one very well-planned ambush, a single victory that echoed for centuries. And as the forest mists settle once again, we'll drift gently into our next historical wander. Another life, another royal disaster, another softly absurd character waiting just ahead. Hey everyone, settle back in. Let your breathing soften. Tonight, we're drifting into the twilight rooms of late medieval France, where velvet curtains hung heavy, candles flickered too close to tapestries, and one lonely king paced the floor, quietly convinced he was made of very fragile glass. Yes, tonight's bedtime companion is King Charles VI of France, a man whose reign can best be summarized as: France suffers, the king panics, everyone else panics harder. So dim the lights a little more, pull your blanket closer. We're drifting into the life of a king who tried his best, but whose mind wandered off without leaving a forwarding address. A quiet entrance into a chaotic crown. Charles VI was born in 1368, an era in which France was politely described as a mess. The 100 Years' War was underway. The English were doing their standard English thing, invading whenever convenient. The French nobility was loudly arguing about taxes, prestige, and whether or not their hats were big enough. Charles ascended the throne at the age of 11, which is generally not the ideal age for running a medieval superpower. At 11, most children are still deciding whether mud is edible. Fortunately, Charles had uncles, several of them. These uncles were thrilled to help rule the kingdom, and by help, they meant raising taxes, draining the treasury, fighting each other, and politely ignoring the fact that the country was crumbling like old cheese still. Charles grew up gentle, mild, patient, much too patient for the family he had. By the time he turned 20, he managed to push his uncles aside. He took the reins of the kingdom with a quiet determination, the sort of determination usually found in people who underestimate how exhausting leadership actually is. For about 5 years, he ruled well. France stabilized. Laws were clarified. Armies became less chaotic. People dared to smile again, cautiously, the way you do when the storm clouds look lighter but you're still holding an umbrella just in case. And then, because history cannot resist a dramatic mood shift, Charles's mind began to unravel. The first fracture, a very unfortunate forest ride. It began in 1392. Charles was 24. Healthy, hopeful, surrounded by nobles who constantly argued, which did not help his stress levels. A friend and advisor of Charles had been attacked and nearly killed by someone harboring a long, petty grudge. Charles, being loyal, decided to march the army to Brittany to demand justice. It was hot. The soldiers were tired. Everyone was sweaty and annoyed. Then, as the king rode through a quiet forest, a barefoot man ran into the middle of the road. He grabbed the king's horse, and in that tense, dreadful whisper that only prophets and sleep-deprived insomniacs can produce, he murmured, "Turn back, you are betrayed." Naturally, the army ignored him, but Charles carried the dread. A little while later, as the troop continued through the woodland heat, a page dropped a lance. It hit a shield. It made a sharp metallic crack. That sound snapped something inside Charles's head. He drew his sword. He attacked. Not enemies, not assassins, but his own knights, his own men, his closest companions. He fought like a man possessed. 4 were killed before he was restrained, and when they finally forced him to the ground, the king lay trembling, repeating the same hollow phrase, "I do not know who I am." Medieval sources describe this moment with the subtlety of a historian trying not to sound alarmed. But the message is clear. Charles VI had suffered a psychotic break, one that would return again and again for the remaining 30 years of his life. Let's drift into the madness after the forest episode. Charles experienced long stretches of disorientation. Sometimes he forgot his wife, sometimes he forgot his children, sometimes he forgot he was king, and sometimes, most famously, he forgot he was human. Thus began the most surreal chapter of his condition, the glass delusion. Charles became convinced that his body was made of delicate, transparent glass, not metaphorical glass, not symbolic glass, actual, shatter and impact glass. He refused to sit unless cushions were piled beneath him. He avoided touching people, fearing he'd break. He ordered his clothes reinforced with iron stays to protect his fragile form. Imagine a medieval king robe's crown, scepter moving about as if the slightest bump might turn him into expensive glitter. This belief wasn't unique to him. The glass delusion had a brief popularity among the anxious elite of medieval Europe, because apparently, when you give people too much money and too much pressure, they start thinking they're vases. But Charles lived with this fear for years. He walked slowly. He spoke softly. He isolated himself, swaddled in layers of caution and melancholy. And when he wasn't glass, he sometimes believed his name was George's, or that he had no family, or that he had never been crowned. These were the peaceful episodes, the quiet ones, the ones where he simply drifted into another identity, like a man slipping into a dream. The violent episodes were worse. France interrupted. Charles's fragile mental state created a vacuum, one instantly filled by powerful, loudly ambitious relatives. 2 factions soon emerged. The Armagnacs, led by Charles's brother-in-law, Bernard of Armagnac; the Burgundians, led by the king's cousin, John the Fearless, whose nickname suggests subtlety was not his strongest trait. Both sides insisted, very gently of course, that they were merely trying to support the king. In reality, they were trying to control France by controlling access to Charles. Picture a king who sometimes believed he was made of glass, now surrounded by scheming relatives prepared to start wars over a chair next to his bed. Whenever Charles regained clarity in good days, peaceful days, he tried to mediate. He hoped for harmony, reconciliation, stability. Naturally, this made things worse. Both sides took his brief moments of lucidity as proof that he supported them. They used the king's fragile mind as a political weapon, and France descended into factional conflict, so petty it could have its own soap opera. Then the English noticed, because the English always notice when France is distracted. Henry V steps in, because why not? By the early 1400s, Henry V of England, a man who enjoyed conquering France with the same enthusiasm some people reserve for gardening, decided it was the perfect time to resume the war. With France internally divided, Henry invaded. This led to the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, a battle remembered mostly for English longbows, French heavy armor, mud, and the realization that too much nobility on one battlefield is never a good idea. France was crushed, not permanently, just thoroughly enough that everyone needed a long nap afterward. Through all of this, Charles drifted in and out of awareness. Some days he recognized no one. Some days he muttered to himself in dark corners. Some days he wandered the palace for hours, searching for servants who could no longer stand to be near the unpredictable king. And some days, miraculously, he was clear, steady, calm, as if his mind had returned from a long journey to say hello before drifting off again. These flickers of clarity broke the hearts of those who loved him, because each time he seemed himself again. It was temporary. a gentle tide going out too soon. The saddest treaty, signed by a man who was barely present. In 1420, the infamous Treaty of Troyes was signed. It declared that after Charles's death, the Kingdom of France would pass not to his son, the Dauphin Charles, later Charles VII, but to Henry V of England. In effect, France's ruling dynasty of Valois being dissented benders, the treaty's defenders claimed Charles had agreed willingly. Its critics pointed out that Charles spent this period not entirely aware of where he was, who he was. Either way, the treaty became one of the bleakest moments of his reign. A king alive but absent, a kingdom alive but leaderless, a court drifting from crisis to crisis like a candle flickering in a drafty hallway. Ironically, both Henry V and Charles VI died within 2 years of the treaty. Henry's infant son, Henry VI, was proclaimed king of both England and France, at least on paper. The French, meanwhile, immediately ignored the treaty, because medieval politics had strong terms and conditions do not apply energy, and Charles VII disinherited or not would eventually reclaim the throne. But all of that belongs to another episode. Tonight, we stay with Charles VI. The long, soft decline. Charles's final years were quiet, gentle, sad in a muted, resigned sort of way. His wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, often stayed away, partly due to political pressure, partly due to exhaustion. Their children visited occasionally. Servants tiptoed around him, doctors hovered, priests muttered prayers, nobles argued in the corridors outside, and Charles wandered, sometimes speaking to shadows, sometimes to the ghosts in his mind, sometimes to no one at all. He died in 1422, at 53. The country he left behind was fractured, exhausted, half occupied by the English, and deeply traumatized by decades of instability. But Charles himself, he remains one of the most human kings in history. Not grand, not powerful, not terrifying, not tyrannical, just fragile, gentle, unwell, trapped between responsibility and a mind that never stayed steady long enough to let him rule the way he wanted. A king who drifted through life like a ghost in his own palace. And now, let's drift forward as we let Charles VI rest quietly and finally free from the heavy weight he carried. We'll move onwards to our next historical wandering, the royally unfortunate life, another softly spiraling dynasty, another bedtime companion from the dusty halls of Europe. Hey everyone, let's ease back into our cozy historical drift. Settle in, loosen your shoulders. Let whatever noise is buzzing around your day fade into the background. Tonight, we are wandering into a palace not made of stone alone, but of curiosities. A palace where astronomy charts piled up like laundry, where alchemists ran questionable experiments in the basement, where paintings of mythical beasts hung crookedly in long, dim corridors. Tonight's sleepy companion is Emperor Rudolph II, the Holy Roman Emperor who loved science, art, and occult curiosities far more than he ever loved ruling. A man who collected everything except political stability. A ruler whose empire slowly fell apart while he gazed longingly at his astrology tables, wondering which star was personally sabotaging him. So let the lights dim just a little more. We're drifting into one of history's most quietly chaotic courts, Prague, under Rudolph II. A quiet beginning for a future eccentric. Rudolph II was born in 1552 into the famously dysfunctional Habsburg family. This was a lineage that had mastered 3 things: inbreeding, religious conflict, and looking permanently exhausted. Rudolph's father, Emperor Maximilian II, at least tried to keep things balanced, reasonable, moderate. But Rudolph was raised partly in the Spanish court of Philip II. Spanish court life was rigid, structured, a place where everyone tried to out-serious one another. Children were expected to behave like polite furniture. Rudolph absorbed all the solemnity, all the introspection, and absolutely none of the discipline. He grew up quiet, withdrawn, a little gloomy, the sort of child who would stare too long at a candle flame and worry everyone in the room without saying a word. But he also grew up fascinated by the unseen forces of the world: astronomy, astrology, mysticism, alchemy. If it involved stars, spirits, or substances that might explode unexpectedly. Rudolf was most certainly interested. His tutors took note. Some were concerned, others encouraged him, because medieval tutors had a long tradition of giving children questionable intellectual hobbies. In 1576, at 24, Rudolf became Holy Roman Emperor. This would have been a promising start, if Rudolf had any interest in governing actual people. He did not. He preferred objects, ideas, beautiful things that never talked back. Welcome to Prague, the capital of melancholy. Rudolf moved his imperial residence to Prague, something no one had done in a long time. Vienna was too political, too noisy, too full of expectations. Prague was different, foggy, mysterious, a comfortable place for an emperor who preferred moonlit solitude to meetings. Once settled, Rudolf began transforming the castle into what could only be described as the largest cabinet of curiosities in Europe. He collected paintings, relics, rare instruments, strange stones, mechanical devices that clicked and whirred for no practical reason. Animals stuffed and displayed in poses that suggested the taxidermist had questions about anatomy. Artisans adored him. Scientists flocked to him. Alchemists came running. Prague became a bustling center for anyone who wanted to discover the philosopher's stone, predict the future from planetary motion, or simply explode things in interesting ways. At one point, Rudolf employed Tycho Brahe, the famously noseless astronomer, and Johannes Kepler, who quietly longed for co-workers who did not drink mercury. Rudolf loved them both, so long as they didn't ask him to make political decisions. Drifting into a melancholy fog, Rudolf suffered from lifelong depression. Melancholy, they called it then. It ebbed and flowed like the tides. Sometimes he was functional, thoughtful, even charming in a gently distracted way. Other times, he shut himself away for weeks, speaking to almost no one, consumed by dread, suspicion, and a depth of sadness that worried even his stern Habsburg relatives. He slept irregularly, ate irregularly. He paced at night, muttering softly about conspiracies, stars, and fate. He feared poisoning, feared betrayal, feared the responsibilities of ruling the messy, argumentative collection of states that made up the Holy Roman Empire. This constant anxiety made him retreat deeper into his collections, deeper into astrology, deeper into the comforting world of objects rather than people. Visitors described him as wandering the palace in long robes, quiet as a ghost, pausing occasionally to study a painting as if it might whisper a secret, ruling an empire by avoiding everyone in it. While Rudolf stared at celestial charts, the empire slowly began dissolving under the weight of unresolved conflicts. There were Protestant princes demanding autonomy, Catholic nobles demanding control, the Ottoman Empire pressing in from the east, and Rudolf's family urging him to make decisions. Any decisions, preferably coherent ones. Rudolf managed the stress by refusing most meetings. Letters piled up unanswered. Ambassadors waited weeks for an audience. Armies received no instructions. His method of ruling can best be described as, if I don't acknowledge it, maybe it will stop existing. Unsurprisingly, this did not work. By the late 1590s, the Ottomans were attacking again. The empire needed leadership. Rudolf needed a nap. Nobles pushed him. Generals begged him. His brother Matthias, seeing an opportunity, quietly prepared to take over. Rudolf responded to this family pressure by commissioning more artwork and hiring additional astrologers. As strategies go, it was not effective, but it was extremely on brand. The alchemists, Prague's strangest workforce. Rudolf genuinely believed alchemy could unlock the universe. He funded dozens of practitioners. He gave them laboratories stocked with bizarre metals, rare chemicals, and the occasional dangerous ingredient that probably should have been illegal. It was a golden age for alchemy, a chaotic age, an age where experiments frequently produced more smoke than progress. One alchemist blew a hole in a wall. Another set fire to a tapestry of St. Wenceslas. Another brewed a potion described by a witness as thick, purple, and deeply unsettling. Rudolf loved it all. The mystery, the spectacle, the possibility. however small, that someone might actually succeed in creating gold or immortality. Whenever a new alchemist arrived, Rudolf welcomed him eagerly. Whenever an alchemist fled Prague in disgrace, Rudolf barely noticed. His treasury shrank, his curiosity cabinet grew, and Prague's citizens began referring to the court as that place where strange men go to spill boiling liquids on themselves. Art, beauty, and the emperor's escapes for all his political failures. Rudolf made Prague and Europe more beautiful. He was one of the greatest art patrons in history. He collected works by Dürer, Arcimboldo, Bruegel, Titian. He commissioned new paintings that merged myth, science, and strange imagination. He encouraged artisans to experiment, to innovate, to craft instruments, globes, mechanical wonders. He also adored bizarre animals. He kept lions, tigers, exotic birds, a collection of monkeys that reportedly drove several servants to exhaustion. He bought objects without knowing exactly what they were. He simply liked the texture, the sparkle, the shape. In this sense, Rudolf was the medieval equivalent of an enthusiastic online shopper. But not everything in his collection was harmless. He also amassed weapons, machines, and objects of occult ritual that made visiting priests visibly uncomfortable. All of this was escape, a way to soften the world, to distract himself from the responsibility he dreaded. And the more the world demanded his attention, the deeper into his treasures he retreated. A family that wanted his throne even more than his company. Rudolf's younger brother, Matthias, was the exact opposite of him. Determined, bold, politically active, possessing a personality best described as impatient but effective. As Rudolf neglected governance, Matthias gained popularity among nobles desperate for anyone who might actually answer letters. By 1606, Matthias began acting independently, negotiating peace deals, organizing armies, charming political allies. Rudolf watched this with growing paranoia. He feared Matthias. He distrusted nearly everyone. He locked himself in his palace for days at a time. When he did emerge, he looked pale, exhausted, and deeply confused, like a man waking from a long dream that hadn't ended yet. Eventually, the nobles chose sides, and very few chose Rudolf. The slow, inevitable takeover in 1608, Matthias marched toward Prague with an army. Not a threatening posture, of course, just a gentle, heavily armed suggestion that Rudolf should share power. Rudolf panicked. He hid behind his astrologers. He performed long, brooding walks. He tried to predict Matthias's movements by charting planetary alignments. The planets were not helpful. Rudolf reluctantly agreed to hand over control of Austria, Hungary, and Moravia. He kept Bohemia Prague for himself, a symbolic throne for a symbolic emperor. He was still technically Holy Roman Emperor, but only in the way a retired professor is still technically a professor. Matthias waited for Rudolf to falter again. Everyone waited. Rudolf, wrapped in melancholy and stargazing, was not difficult to predict. The defenestration that ended an era in 1611, Rudolf attempted one last political maneuver. He invited an army of Catholic allies, the Paso Raiders, into Bohemia to intimidate his enemies. Naturally, the mercenaries began looting the countryside instead, because when you hire an army at a discount, that's what happens. Bohemians revolted. The situation dissolved into chaos. Matthias seized the opportunity. He had Rudolf deposed as King of Bohemia. 1 year later, in 1612, Rudolf died, alone, surrounded by objects, his collections towering over him like silent companions. He died as he lived quietly, mysteriously, and in the shadow of the things he treasured more than power. Rudolf's strange legacy. History remembers Rudolf II as a patron of science, a lover of art, a melancholic recluse, and a ruler who oversaw the slow cracking of a fragile empire. His collections scattered across museums. His court became legend, half wonder, half cautionary tale. His name slipped into folklore as the emperor who chased immortality and lost everything else in the process. But to the artists, the dreamers, the quiet souls who stare at the night sky and wonder what's out there, Rudolf remains strangely comforting. a gentle reminder that not everyone built for power actually wants it. Some just want beauty, curiosity, mystery, even if the world expects them to rule. And now, we drift onward. As Rudolph disappears into the misty halls of his Prague palace, we'll wander toward the next life, another royal who stumbled, spiraled, or sank beneath the weight of their own strangeness. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake after everything we've drifted through so far, congratulations. UVA officially lasted longer than several of Rome's finest generals did in the forests of Germania. And if you're dozing off already, well, that's honestly the point. So settle your shoulders, maybe adjust your blanket, and let's keep floating through the sleepy haze of ancient history. And tonight, we wander a little further into the long shadow Arminius left behind, the confusion, the political fallout, and of course, the deeply dysfunctional family drama that unfolded in the years after his death. Because in the ancient world, it wasn't enough to lead a rebellion, or unite scattered tribes, or ruin the career of a Roman governor. You also had to deal with your in-laws, and naturally, that was often worse. Let's drift gently into the quiet that came after the screaming stopped. The silence after Teutoburg. Historians like to say that the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest changed the course of European history. And yes, in a broad, sweeping, look at my academic thesis way, it did. Rome never again tried to transform Germania into a tidy little province with villas and bathhouses and slightly confused tax collectors. Instead, they settled for standing on the Rhine and staring into the woods like they were waiting for a jump scare. But while all that geopolitical weight is interesting, what's more soothing for tonight is the aftermath. The strange stillness, the kind of sigh that societies take when they're exhausted. Arminius himself spent the years after the battle doing what many successful revolutionaries do, fighting with the people he supposedly liberated. Because, of course, unity is easier when there's a giant empire looming over you, and dramatically harder when everyone has free time again. He tried to maintain a coalition of tribes, but Germanic politics were basically the ancient version of group chat arguments. Everyone had opinions, nobody agreed on anything, and somebody was always offended on principle. Arminius wanted a federation. The chieftains wanted to go home, tend their cattle, and occasionally raid a Roman outpost if they were bored enough. And through all this, Rome watched, annoyed but patient, especially Emperor Tiberius, who nursed resentment like a houseplant. Sergestus, the very unhelpful father-in-law. If you thought Arminius's political struggles were complicated, his family situation could have been its own tragic sitcom. You might remember Sergestus, the man who objected to Arminius marrying his daughter Thusnelda, and spent the next decade acting like a walking cautionary tale. Sergestus had the emotional consistency of a weather vane, and his allegiance shifted just as quickly. Every disappointment in his life somehow became Arminius's fault. When Arminius became the hero of Germania, Sergestus was horrified, not because of the rebellion, not because of the violence, but because his son-in-law was getting more attention than he was, and that, truly, was unforgivable. At one point, Sergestus had his own daughter, Arminius's pregnant wife, locked up in his house. Arminius stormed in to get her back. Sergestus escaped to the Romans. Thusnelda did not. The entire situation quickly spiraled into a kind of ancient custody battle, except with legions and tribal militias, and absolutely no one behaving like an adult. Thusnelda was taken to Rome, paraded, displayed, used as the empire's reminder that they still controlled some parts of the narrative, even if they couldn't control the forests. And through all of it, Arminius could only rage from a distance, unable to do much more than fume and occasionally lecture his followers about the relentless evil of both Sergestus and Rome, probably in that exact order. A rebel without a future, Arminius's influence, for a few years, was enormous. Young warriors admired him, elders tolerated him, rivals pretended to be his allies while sharpening metaphorical knives behind his back. But his downfall was almost inevitable. A leader whose main unifying argument was Rome is terrible, needed Rome to remain an active threat. And when Rome pulled back, consolidated, and decided to stick with rivers as natural borders. Arminius was left with a coalition held together by disappointment and mutual suspicion. Tribal leaders accused him of wanting to be king, which, to be fair, he almost certainly did. Arminius denied it, because no Germanic chieftain could admit ambition out loud without causing a moral crisis. But ambition hung around him like a faint smell of campfire smoke. Eventually, rivals decided they were tired of him. He was assassinated by his own people in 21 CE. No Rome, no heroic final stand, just the usual quiet, grim efficiency of internal politics. His death barely caused a ripple. Even Tacitus, Rome's moody historian in residence, remarked that the tribes were capable of destroying great leaders just as efficiently as they destroyed Roman armies. You could almost hear his sigh through the manuscript. This eldest child, raised by Rome, claimed by no one. Remember Arminius' son, born in captivity, raised in Rome, given the kind of education someone thought a prince of Germania should have, which probably involved learning Latin and being very confused during history lessons. The child's name was Thumalicus, and, unfortunately, his life was short, obscure, and not particularly happy. Tacitus tells us he died in his youth, a phrase that historians love because it sounds informative while being completely useless. He was a foreign prince, raised as a Roman, a political pawn that Rome eventually lost interest in, a symbol without a future. Arminius and the Snelder's line simply fizzled out in the Roman world, like embers smothered by damp ash. It's quiet, sad in a slow, grey way, and it fits the tone of the entire story. Triumph, then disappointment, hope, then erosion. A loud victory followed by an ending that barely whispered. Carusi, without their hero, the Carusi tribe, Arminius' people, didn't enjoy life after his death. Without his leadership, they fell into infighting, then into decline, and eventually became one of those tribes that historians list in footnotes, with phrases like absorbed by neighbors and no longer identifiable as a separate polity. It's the ancient version of being removed from the group photo. Arminius had been their brightest flare, and with him gone, they slowly faded into the wide, shifting cultural landscape of early Germanic Europe. His uncle Inguiama died on another battlefield. His brother Flavus, the good Roman soldier, stayed loyal to the empire and lived out a quiet, imperial-approved life. Not a heroic one, not a meaningful one, just tidy and slightly sad. If Arminius' story was fire and blood and rebellion, his family's stories were more like long, heavy sighs. Rome moves on, politely forgetting its embarrassment. After Teutoburg, Rome took a long, hard look at itself and decided that certain things were simply not worth the trouble. Germania was quietly placed on the do not pursue list, right under Scottish Highlands and anywhere with excessive mud. The legions rebuilt their pride by winning battles somewhere else, preferably in places with better weather and fewer unpredictable oak trees. Verus was officially blamed. His family mourned. Augustus aged 10 years in one evening and asked repeatedly for the return of his legions. Tiberius pretended he had always opposed the campaign. Germanicus, popular and annoyingly competent, swept through Germania for a few years to show that Rome could still win if it really wanted to. Then he was recalled, because Tiberius disliked anyone being more likable than he was. And that was that. The empire shifted its gaze eastward. The forests of Germania grew thick again. The Rhine remained the border, and Arminius faded from Roman writings, occasionally resurfacing when a historian needed an example of barbarian threat. See also, people who refuse to be conquered. Memory turns to myth. The Germanic tribes didn't leave written records, so Arminius' memory lingered through oral tradition, songs, tales, fireside retellings at night. Over time, the edges of his story softened, blurred, expanded. He became larger, then stranger, then symbolic. Centuries later, medieval chroniclers retrofitted him into genealogies and gave him attributes he probably didn't possess. Early modern writers turned him into a proto-national hero. 19th century nationalist movements inflated him into Hermann the Liberator, complete with statues, heroic poetry, and a kind of patriotic romanticism that requires ignoring most historical facts. He became everything except the deeply human figure he truly was, a clever, flawed, ambitious noble who played both sides until he committed too deeply to one of them. His historical self was lost in the noise of retellings. His myth, however, grew taller than the trees of Teutoburg, a quiet legacy. If Arminius had been born Roman and stayed Roman, he might have become a senator, perhaps a general, perhaps a career soldier somewhere in Syria, complaining about the heat and writing long, slightly bored letters to his brother about troop movements and administrative nonsense. Instead, he became a rebel, and then a martyr, and then a legend. But the real legacy he left behind was the border, the quiet line between Rome and the Germanic world, a line that shaped future migrations, a line that altered the contours of medieval Europe, a line that endured long after every participant in the battle had dissolved back into the soil. The Rhine didn't care, of course. Rivers rarely do, but people do, and that's why the story stayed alive, floating toward the end as we drift toward the end of his tale. It's worth remembering that Arminius was not a hero in the modern sense. He was not a villain either. He was something far more human, proud, impulsive, charismatic, reckless, loyal, treacherous, brilliant, and occasionally rather dramatic. He changed history because Rome underestimated him, and his own people underestimated the cost of following him. His victory was astonishing, but his life afterward was a slow unraveling. And yet, in the quiet of the night, his story is oddly peaceful. A rise, a fall, a fading, a loud beginning softened by a gentle end, just the way a bedtime history tale should be. Hey everyone, welcome back. Settle down again, maybe smooth your blanket, and let your mind loosen round the edges. Tonight, we're floating all the way to the shimmering courts of the Ottoman Empire, a place of silks, incense, political intrigue, and at least in the case of tonight's subject, a rather impressive dedication to staying gently, consistently, and sometimes alarmingly intoxicated. Yes, tonight's royal enthusiast of altered states is Sultan Selim II, known to his admirers as Selim the Blonde, known to his critics as Selim the Drunk, and known to future historians as the emperor who slipped on a wet floor and ended an entire dynasty's stability, which is a very poetic way of saying that sometimes life and tile comes at you fast. Let's drift softly into his world. A prince who preferred wine to war, Selim II was born in 1524, the son of the legendary Suleiman the Magnificent. Now, Suleiman was one of those exhausting overachievers of history, Bakara, lawmaker, poet, arch-patron of the arts, and annoyingly good at personal discipline. His son Selim was not. He had the emotional energy of a man repeatedly waking from naps he did not intend to take. He was uninterested in leading armies, uninterested in governing, and very interested in grape-based liquids of every possible variety. If there was a winery, Selim was nearby. If there was a banquet, he was already seated. If there was a bottle sealed in a cabinet, Selim had probably opened it before breakfast. Most Ottoman princes spent their youth learning military command. Selim spent his youth learning fermentation. Military advisors would lecture him about troop formations. He would nod politely and go back to swirling a cup of Cyprus vintage like a medieval sommelier. It wasn't that he was lazy, just spiritually aligned with reclining. The Ottoman court adjusts. Sort of. You might think his father, Suleiman, would have been furious with his son's priorities. But no, Suleiman was a patient man, and also deeply in love with Selim's mother, Harim Sultana, woman who could probably have negotiated peace between warring planets if asked. So Selim remained the favored son, despite having the least emperor energy of the family. While his brothers rode horses and swung swords, Selim collected rare wines and grew a reputation for being pleasantly mellow, except when he wasn't standing up straight. Court officials, seeing the future, quietly began adjusting their expectations. They lowered military duties for him. They increased administrative support around him. They possibly installed extra cushions in strategic locations. People like to say Selim grew up in the shadow of Suleiman, but honestly, he He grew up in the comfortable seating area of that shadow, sipping something sweet, enjoying the shade, and wondering why anyone needed to conquer anything when reclining already existed. The imperial winery phase. As an adult prince, Selim's priorities only intensified. He had a favorite region for wine, Cyprus, and this, miraculously, is how geopolitical history happened. Imagine a modern leader demanding that their nation invade a territory because they like the wine, and imagine the advisors nodding and saying, "Yes, Your Majesty." That does sound strategically essential. Selim, according to more than one historical account, supported a military campaign against Cyprus, in part because its vineyards were exceptional, and, naturally, because he felt the Venetians didn't appreciate the wine properly, a sin, in his view. The Ottoman Empire did invade, they did conquer Cyprus, and Selim rewarded the entire endeavor by celebrating extensively with the beverage that had launched the campaign. It was, in many ways, the most on-brand thing he ever did, ascending the throne, gently, perhaps tipsily. When Selim finally became Sultan in 1566, the empire was expecting another Suleiman, the brilliant, poetic emperor who reshaped the Mediterranean. What they got was a man best described by one ambassador as affable, harmless, and committed to personal relaxation. A man who believed in delegation long before management books were invented. He delegated the military campaigns. He delegated diplomacy. He delegated finances. He delegated the daily schedule. He may have delegated some decisions about his own meals. The real power fell to his Grand Vizier, Sukarlu Mehmed Pasha, who had approximately 3 functioning nervous systems to keep up with everything. Selim's rule wasn't disastrous. It was cushioned, soft around the edges, like a government politely run by someone else while the ruler enjoyed an extended early retirement. The palace staff eventually became extremely skilled at balancing 2 realities, keeping the empire functioning, keeping the sultan in a stable, horizontal, and hydrated state. A sultan of simple pleasures, Selim II loved 2 things above all else. Wine hammams, bathhouses, a perfect day for him, involved both, preferably in alternating sequence. Foreign dignitaries would write letters home describing banquets where Selim looked radiant, which is diplomatic language for the sultan was having an extremely enthusiastic evening. His rooms were filled with goblets, carefully imported blends, and bottles labeled with the elegance of a man who absolutely took his hobby seriously. If he were alive today, he would be one of those wine influencers who swirled glasses on camera and said things like, "Ah yes, notes of apricot, melancholy, and mild regret." Selim wasn't mentally checked out. He loved hearing reports, listening to poetry, and attending ceremonies. He just preferred doing all of it in a pleasantly softened state. The most relaxed empire in the world, Selim's rule had a strange effect on the mood of the empire. Governors were calmer. Generals were more patient. The court was significantly quieter, possibly because everyone was trying not to wake the sultan from leisurely naps. Even foreign ambassadors noted the stillness that seemed to permeate the palace. The Ottomans remained powerful, but the constant tense push of ambition had softened. History usually remembers Selim as a weak ruler, but in truth, he simply wasn't interested in the exhausting drama of leadership. He preferred the slow burn of contentment, a warm bath, a warm drink, a warm evening. The world could conquer itself. The tile floor incident, Selim II's death, is famous because it is so deeply, profoundly, undignified. One of those moments where history quietly lowers its eyes and murmurs, "Oh, oh no." He had enjoyed a session in the palace hammam, perhaps a little too enthusiastically, and on his way out, he slipped on the wet tiles and hit his head. This was not the heroic death of emperors, not a battle, not a conspiracy, not a tragic illness, just the eternal enemy of relaxed people everywhere, a slippery floor. His passing was mourned, but quietly, and perhaps with the faint sigh of inevitability. The empire survived, of course. Sukarlu Mehmed Pasha continued running things. The dynasty continued, but historians could never resist the irony. A sultan who spent his life floating eventually slipped. Legacy, A very cozy golden age. Selim II's reputation has been treated with gentle mockery for centuries, but he left behind an empire stable enough to survive another 100 years of complicated politics, court rivalries, and slightly dubious sultans. He didn't expand the empire, but he didn't destroy it either. He didn't write poetry, but he appreciated being read too. He didn't lead armies, but he enjoyed listening to victories while reclining comfortably. He might, in a way, be the most relatable emperor of all time. History loves conquerors, but sometimes the world needs one ruler who simply says, "What if we didn't?" and then pours another drink. Selim II remains a reminder that not every chapter of history is driven by ambition or violence. Some chapters are powered entirely by the desire to relax in a warm bath with the finest wine of the Mediterranean. And honestly, that's a comforting thought for bedtime.